Hola, clase. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I'm going to take this lecture today, this conversation today. It's not really a conversation if I'm having it with myself, I suppose. Take this time today to do a very impossible task, which is to give you a very brief general introduction to the field and study of philosophy. Now, I say this is an impossible task because philosophy, amongst the academic disciplines, philosophy is without a doubt the oldest of the academic disciplines in the Western world, going back to roughly the 2nd century BC. So you're talking about a field of study that's been around for about 2,500 years. And during that time has covered a range of topics, everything from the existence of God to the mating habits of bees, right? And everything from mathematics to ethics to logic to art. All modern disciplines have their origins and their birth from philosophy. Of course, nowadays they have diverged from philosophy. They've split off from philosophy. Yet the study of philosophy still persists. So I'm going to give you a very general introduction to the field of philosophy, the ancient study of philosophy, and nowadays kind of how people approach philosophy and the issues/problems that people deal with, that philosophers deal with in the general field of philosophy nowadays. So, like I said before, philosophy in the Western world goes back to ancient Greece. In the Eastern world, you have various philosophical traditions. The Vedic tradition going back to ancient India, about 1500 BC, the rise of the 100 schools of thought in classical Chinese philosophy going back to the Chinese Warring States period. Philosophy in some form or another, though, has appeared in most cultures, in most indigenous societies. If you look, there's typically a form of philosophy. However, and we'll talk about this later on in the course, philosophy and religion have always been kind of closely linked with one another. And in some traditions, philosophy and religion never really separated. So I say all that to say in this presentation specifically, we're going to be talking more so about Western philosophy, although in this course we will talk about other philosophical traditions as well. So what is philosophy? What does it mean to do philosophy or to practice philosophy? The definition of philosophy that I had to memorize when I was a lowly undergraduate philosophy student, taking my very first introduction to philosophy class, like you are now, the definition that was drilled into my head that I still remember is that philosophy is a search for a fundamental understanding of the world around us through the process of critical thinking and critical discussion. Forgot to show you the slide with the definition. Philosophy is a search for a fundamental understanding of the world. We could also say a fundamental understanding of the universe through the process of critical thinking and critical discussion. Now, those last two things are very important because the study of philosophy is much different than philosophy that's the word that's used in common conversation. Oftentimes, if you're talking to somebody, they might say something along the lines of, well, my philosophy of X, Y, or Z. And in this regard, philosophy is understood to be a matter of opinion. What is your philosophy of life? What is your view? What is your understanding of what life is, what the meaning of life is? This is how most people use the word. However, if we're talking about the academic study of philosophy, it's not simply a matter of opinion or belief. The academic study of philosophy is governed by critical thinking, the rules which govern our thought, what determines correct thought, critical thinking, and critical discussion. Philosophy is inherently a group/social endeavor. It's not just a single person sitting alone in their room trying to figure out the nature of the universe. Philosophy has this sort of back and forth social dynamic to it, where I might propose an idea and you might critique/give me feedback on that idea. And it's this sort of back and forth conversation between two people who are critically engaged. Now, as far as what does it mean to practice philosophy, this gets into the general broad categories of philosophy. And I have 5 categories listed here. This is sort of the classical distinction, first kind of constructed by the Greek philosopher Aristotle here. Nowadays, 21st century philosophy, there are literally hundreds of different categories, different areas of study that philosophers are vested in and are researching in. These are just the ancient distinctions. So the 5 categories that Aristotle is the father of, really, who sort of outlined and created these categories: logic, ethics, aesthetics, metaphysics, and epistemology. And we're going to kind of go briefly through each of these to kind of give you a shotgun blast of general information about them and what research into these areas might look like. So the first area of philosophy, and perhaps the most important because it relates back to this critical thinking bit that we're talking about, and this matter of opinion contrast that I was trying to give here. So the first area of philosophy is logic. Now, generally speaking, in the broadest sense possible, logic is the rules that governs our thinking. The rules that governs our thinking. Or, in other words, how to think correctly. Logic plays many roles. One of these roles is to help us to identify aspects of our thinking that might be deficient, flaws, or mistakes in our reasoning, and ideally, how to avoid those flaws and mistakes. Now, logic itself is divided up into 2 different branches: formal logic and informal logic. Formal logic, depicted here in this picture, is very closely associated with mathematics. In fact, some philosophers have attempted to argue that mathematics derives its most basic principles from logic. Different conversation from a different day. If you're interested in that, you can look up Bertrand Russell and Albert Whitehead. They wrote an entire book about this. But formal logic is very algebraic. It's very close to modern day algebra. It's a reducing of claims, of sentences to its most basic symbolic structure, and then trying to figure out whether or not the structure of the argument itself is valid, right? Informal logic, as the name suggests, is the sort of logic that deals with the sort of everyday conversation that you might encounter. Another way to kind of divide this is between deductive logic. Deductive logic, again, more closely associated with mathematics, 1 + 1 = 2. Inductive logic dealing with things like I hear a knock at my door. I suspect that my friend James is coming to visit me. Therefore, James is knocking at my door. Inductive logic is kind of the logic of our everyday lives. It's the sort of logic that we all operate on a daily basis. I have a nice quote here. As we've already seen, logic has traditionally been described as the science of thought. Science of thought. If it is a science, logic is a theoretical science, right? It's dealing with propositions, it's dealing with definitions. It's not an empirical science, right? So more closely related to what you would see really in like a introduction to algebra class, right? Basic algebra. So if logic deals with the rules that governs our thinking, this next branch of philosophy, ethics, deals with the rules that governs our behavior, or the rules that ought to govern our behavior. Ethics deals with the basic question, how should we live our lives? How should I live my life? What's the best way for me to live my life? Are there certain rules / principles that I should use or hold up to govern my behavior? Are certain actions inherently good or bad? Is there things that I shouldn't do as a person? What does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to be a good person? Are particular actions right or wrong? All of these are questions of ethics. And ethics, generally construed, again, we can kind of subdivide ethics up into different categories. So you have what's referred to as meta-ethics. Meta-ethics asks this very broad question, what is right and wrong? Is there such a thing as right and wrong? Are right and wrong objective facts about the world? Like, is what is right for me also right for you? And or is it just simply a matter of taste or opinion? That's big, high level ethics, big picture ethics. That's referred to as meta ethics. You also, within the context of meta ethics, you have different ethical theories, right? So an ethical theory is an attempt to describe the general rules of ethics. So you have 4 basic ethical theories. There's a lot more than 4, but I'm just going to give you, again, big picture. You have things like deontological ethics, the idea that particular actions are inherently good or bad. The kind of the antithesis of deontological ethics would be utilitarian ethics, that what is good or bad is decided by the outcome of the action. Sometimes it's called consequentialist ethics, that you should act to produce the greatest amount of good in the world. You have things like rights-based ethics. This is the idea that became popularized during the Enlightenment, that human beings have certain inherent rights. If that language sounds familiar, it's because it's built into the fabric of the US government. Thomas Jefferson ascribed to this view of ethics, right? That all men are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's rights-based ethics. You have virtue-based ethics. This dates back to Aristotle. The idea that we should strive to live a virtuous life. So instead of saying that individual actions are right and wrong, we look at the virtue of the individual as a whole. And then you have social contract theory, which kind of ties into politics, which I talk about here shortly. I realize I listed more than 4. It's hard to keep it at just 4. If you're interested in these, you could just Google like utilitarianism, deontological ethics, and I'll provide you some links here. All of these are huge fields, and people spend their entire careers researching these things. Now, I brought up social contract theory, and there's a very close connection here that may not be super apparent between ethics and government. So ethics deals with the question, the ethics, and this is the distinction that Aristotle made. Ethics deals with the individual. The individual asks the question, how should I live my life? And Aristotle said that this is closely connected with a broader question, which is how should we as a community, how should we live our lives? So for Aristotle, ethics, the question of individual ethics naturally sort of led to the question of group or communal ethics, and that this lied at the heart of the philosophy of government. And now in philosophy, to make a quick point of clarification here, in philosophy, when we deal with questions of governance, questions of, we're dealing with broad general questions. This is not politics as most people understand it, like Democrat versus Republican, conservative versus liberal, although it can get into that. Government as a branch of philosophy asks broad questions such as the nature and the structure of government. What is the best way to organize our lives? What is the best sort of ruling system that we need or ought to establish in order to govern ourselves? Right. So this gets into questions of democracy versus socialism versus take your pick, monarchy, right? What form of government is the best form of government? And what level of participation should the individual citizen have in that government? These are questions of political philosophy, right? Okay, so logic, ethics, aesthetics. Now, I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. So aesthetics deals with questions of art, the philosophy of art, the philosophy of aesthetic judgment, deals with this at its most basic level. It asks the question, what makes something beautiful? What makes something beautiful? So Plato asked this in a rather silly way in one of his dialogues, where Socrates is speaking with one of his interlocutors, and he looks up at the moon, and Socrates says, well, how can I look up at the moon and say that the moon is beautiful, and then look at my wife and say that my wife is beautiful? Right? We're using the same word there, beauty, but we obviously mean different things about it, right? One's a giant floating rock, not floating, but I haven't gotten to gravity yet. And the other is a human being whom I find attractive. So what makes both of those objects beautiful? Because they're categorically different. Is there something that connects this idea of beauty? This also, I have this picture here. So as a little bit of context, I love anime. I've been watching anime since I was in high school. Dragon Ball Z is the very first anime that I watched. So I was super hyped when the Dragon Ball live action movie came out, and it was an absolute dumpster fire of a film. So another sort of questions we can ask in aesthetics is questions about particular forms of art, right? Or you can ask the general question, what makes something art versus non-art, right? Why is it that something I draw is considered a work of art, whereas something my dog draws is not? Well, my dog doesn't draw, but something, an image that my dog makes would not be considered a work of art. You can apply this to specific types of art, such as film. What makes a movie good versus what makes a movie bad, that sort of thing. If any of you are interested in like fashion, I'm not fashionable, but what makes an outfit appealing versus not, what makes something fashion versus not. right? These are general questions of aesthetics. From aesthetics, we move on to metaphysics. And this is another one of those words that's been taken on a different meaning in common use than it means from how we use it in academic philosophy. So I included a picture of Barnes and Noble, a very popular bookstore here. You walk into a Barnes and Noble, oftentimes the philosophy section is next to, sometimes it's labeled as New Age, sometimes it's even labeled as metaphysics, right? But if you walk into Barnes and Noble and you go look at the metaphysics books, you'll find books about like spells and potions and astrology and witchcraft, New Ageism, the New Age religious movement. That's not what we mean by metaphysics in philosophy. In philosophy, metaphysics asks these two basic questions. What is there, or what exists, and what is it like? What is there, what exists, and what is it like? Another way to frame this is you could talk about questions of reality, like what is real, quote unquote, real? Or what is reality like at its most basic / fundamental level? What exists? What does not exist? These are questions of metaphysics. And as a result, metaphysics deals with topics such as God, right? Does God exist? If God does exist, what is God like? What are God's attributes / characteristics, properties? But it can also deal with questions of nowadays what we would call cosmology, right? Do black holes exist? Oh, well, we know black holes exist now, but back in the 1950s, 60s, they were theoretical constructs. Do black holes actually exist? I guess a better question would be like string theory, or the multiverse hypothesis, kind of popular in science right now. Do we live in one universe, or are there multiple universes that our universe exists alongside of or in parallel to, right? These are questions of metaphysics. Does God exist? Does the soul exist, right? Do we survive after death? Does the soul survive after death? Is something like reincarnation possible? Is it possible for the soul to come back to biological life? These would be questions of metaphysics, but also, more quote unquote scientific topics such as the nature and structure of time. Is time real? What is the structure of time? This is actually the area of philosophy that I deal with on an academic level. I write about the nature and the structure of time. This would be a metaphysical topic. And the last branch that we will cover today, epistemology. Epistemology deals with questions of truth. What makes a statement true? What makes something true? What is truth? Are there certain criteria that a statement has to meet in order to be considered true? Is truth universal? Is truth the same across culture, time, space? Right. Epistemology, is there a standard of truth? What does it mean to have a justified belief in something, a justified true belief? You can also get into questions of the philosophy of science here. What makes scientific claims true versus personal beliefs, right? Lots of different areas here. Now, I gave you a very, very brief introduction of philosophy in some very broad categories here. I would encourage you, if you're interested in one of these different areas, to look it up. There's a couple of great websites. Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a great website for this. And you'll see all the different categories, subcategories here. All right, so that's all I got for now. If you got any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I will see y'all again next week.